Bottom line up front again, the 5090 is anywhere from 30 to 68.9% better than the 5080. I'm gonna get demonetized if I point it that way. And that's at 4K gaming, depending on the game, of course, but the results are commonly within that 45 to 55% range. Against the 7900 XTX of a similar price, the 5080 is within striking distance, often within 10% of each other. As for the 4080 versus the 5080, they're commonly within 7 to 12%, kind of boring, and then sometimes up to 20%. But that gets you the basics. There's a ton more nuance to get into today. If you just wanted those expectations and you want to dip out, there you go. See you in the next one. But otherwise, we have a lot to get into for thermals. We have frequency validation, and then we also have some pretty interesting efficiency testing where the 5080 does actually prove itself in a couple places in efficiency benchmarks specifically, where because the power is so much lower on this one than the 5090, it still benefits from that generational uplift, but it benefits even more from the power coming down. And because of the formula of the two, it looks pretty good in those situations sometimes. The thermal testing for the 5090 FE was actually, overall, it was really good for a 2-slot card. It impressed us. The 5080 is a similar cooler. It looks identical for the most part, but there are some key differences. First of all, no liquid metal. It uses thermal paste. And then secondly, there's some changes to the heatsink itself. We're keeping this review really simple and short and straightforward by our standards today, so let's just get right into it. Before that, this video is brought to you by Arctic and the Liquid Freezer 3, which we've tested using our standard methodology and found to be one of the most noise-efficient CPU coolers on our charts. The Liquid Freezer 3 includes rise and offset mounting to improve AMD performance and uses a thicker radiator to further lower the temperatures. Arctic has priced these competitively for AIOs, and you can learn more at the link in the description below. First up, we have to disclose some office gambling behind the scenes. Jimmy has bet Jeremy on the team that if the 5080 can beat the 4090 at any one benchmark, he's gonna get some free tater tots. And I control the benchmarks that are shown. Also, my stomach just growled. I don't know if you could hear that. That actually happened. Let's quickly cover pricing. So the 5080 is $1,000 MSRP. Partner models are a little higher than that in some situations. And the 5090 is $2,000 for the MSRP. They launched at the same time, which is January 30th. And that puts the 5080 at the same price as the 4080 Super, which had dropped the price from the 4080. The 5070 Ti at $750 and the 5070 at $550 will follow in February. Pre-launch pricing on Best Buy indicates that MSRP options will be slim outside of NVIDIA's Founders Edition, so adjust your personal value assessment based on what they actually show up for on launch day. We don't know. We're reviewing this before all of that comes out. The most expensive one that we can see right now is $1,400, so we'd say don't buy that one. The previous generation 4080 launched at $1,200 following the infamous unlaunch of the 4080 12GB, which actually became the 4070 Ti. More recently, the 4080 Super launched at $1,000, providing a value increase despite its nearly indistinguishable performance from the base 4080. The only reason it was interesting was because of the price cut. AMD's Radeon 7900 XTX is the closest competition that it has for the 5080. Currently, the 7900 XTX starts as low as $830, but it's more commonly around $930. Down from that is the 7900 XT, ranging from $650 to $710, and in a decidedly lower price bracket. AMD says its 9070 series cards will be arriving in March. Intel GPUs haven't scaled up to this market category yet. It's a hopeful yet for the record, but for now, they're at the lower end. Now for a quick overview of the specs. If you want more detail on the specs, you should check out our announcement coverage of the card here. It's available in both a written format and in a video, but we'll go over the basics again. The Blackwell architecture-based RTX 5080 has 10,752 CUDA cores and 16 GB of GDDR7 on a 256-bit bus. These specs are way down from the 5090's configuration. It's almost exactly half, making for probably the biggest gap that there's ever been between the top two tiers on launch day. The RTX 5080 is also a PCIe Gen 5 card, but as our recent PCIe scaling benchmark with the 5090 showed, it barely makes a difference at all in games to run on Gen 4 or even Gen 3. This review will again focus on high-end GPUs, and you can see our test methodology on our site at gamersnexus.net. We've got a link below for the test bench information. It's free of third-party ads. It contains our game settings and our test setup. To see the low end, check out our Intel Arc B570 review as well. Time to get into my favorite part for these cards, which is thermal testing. Now, one of the cool things we did for the 5090 review, if you missed it, was Schlieren imaging, where we basically use a parabolic lens, a light source, and a camera to create magic that allowed us to image the air density gradient around the card, and all of that applies to this card as well, because the FE model for the 5080, despite having some key differences internally, externally the flow paths will be basically identical. So you can check that out in the 5090 review if you want to see how it behaves. But let's just get into the thermal benchmark numbers. Here's the thermal chart. Under a full workload for the GPU, the RTX 5080's temperature with auto settings landed at 65 to 66 degrees Celsius for the GPU. Considering the change to thermal paste from liquid metal with the Founders Edition cards, the real impact here to reduce the temperature is in the power consumption reduction, and we'll look at that a little later. RPM is another part. The memory temperature plotted at about 72 to 75 degrees for the 5080, which is well within the TJ Maxx restrictions of the memory on the card, should be about 105 degrees for that. As for the 5080 fan speed, it held about 1470 to 1500 RPM in this test. That makes its acoustic profile very similar to what we saw in the 5090 review, so you can check that for noise samples and a frequency spectrum. It's a little quieter overall. The 5090's GPU temperature in this test was 72 degrees Celsius, with the 5090's memory temperature at 90. We weren't happy about that, despite being within spec, because once it's in a hotbox case, that 90-degree result becomes a concern. Finally, the 5090's fan ran at about 100 RPM higher when left to its own devices, resulting in a 5080 FE, which, despite moving away from liquid metal, is not really at a disadvantage. It's doing okay overall, especially because of the fact that the power consumption is down. Frequency validation's up now. This is just to make sure the card is hitting at least the spec set by NVIDIA. The RTX 5080 clocks in this benchmark held relatively flat, although not perfectly flat, at around 2670 MHz. NVIDIA's website claims 2.62 GHz boost clock, so it's technically exceeding the minimum spec. The RTX 4080 ran at about 2775 MHz in this benchmark, consistent with what we saw between the 5090 and 4090. The frequency is higher on the 4080, but the architecture has changed, and that's made this an indirect comparison. It's not all about the frequency. The RTX 5090 bounces around between 2475 to 2670 MHz or so, mostly landing below the 5080. It's relatively common for these fuller configurations to run lower clocks than the lower spec parts, but with higher core counts instead. And now time to get into the gaming numbers. We'll keep this really fast and straightforward this time because we just have a couple key comparisons we want to repeatedly make here, and it's relatively simple, so let's get into those. Final Fantasy XIV's up first and at 4K. The 5080 landed at 112 FPS average, behind the RTX 4090's 139 FPS average result and the 5090's 182 FPS average result. So, unfortunately for Jimmy on our team, he hasn't yet won the bet from Jeremy. This makes the 5090 faster than the 5080 by a massive 62%. AMD's 7900 XTX directly competes with the 5080, but it does allow the 5080 a lead of just under 10 FPS in this benchmark at this resolution. Lows are about the same between them. Against the 4080 and the 4080 Super, the 5080 is about 15% better. Generationally, by name, the 3080 held a 71 FPS average in this benchmark, yielding a 58% uplift to the 5080. The 2080 Ti's 54 FPS average gets basically doubled by the 5080. As a note, some of these charts have the 1070, the 1060, the 2060, and other older cards on them you may find interesting. If you want that data at any point in this review, just pause on the chart, we won't be reading through them all. The 1080 Ti hasn't yet been rerun this year. At 1440p, the RTX 5080 held 217 FPS average against the 5090's 317 FPS average. We're not fully CPU bound here yet, so the 5090 still has a relatively high scaling of 46% ahead of the 5080. For the same comparison, the 4090 led the 4080 original by 36% and the Super by basically the same, because they're basically the same card. The 7900 XTX remains neck and neck with the 5080, with the two functionally identical from a player experience standpoint. They look the same to you. The 5080 is technically ahead. The 7900 XTX is the strongest competition, though, to the 5080 in the rasterized test when looking at pricing. The 4080 and the 4080 Super improved from about 200 FPS average to 217 with the 5080, or a relatively boring 8 to 9%. Down the stack, we have the 7900 XT at 171 FPS average, the 4070 Ti at 151 FPS average, and the 6950 XT at 150. The generational comparison to the 3080's 129 FPS average gives the 5080 a 68% improvement, a bit better than observed at 4K. Finally, for Final Fantasy, the final resolution is 1080p, and that has the 5090 at the same impressive 407 FPS number that we mentioned last week, with the 5080 at 302 FPS average now. Despite the heavier CPU load at this resolution, the advantage remains 35% for the 5090 over the 5080. Still, that's nothing compared to what we saw at 4K. The 4090 leads the 5080 by 24% at 376 FPS average to 302. The 7900 XTX is closer than ever to the 5080 and is tied in all practical senses. It's looking good here, especially with the price, but this ignores ray tracing testing that tends to still favor NVIDIA. Let's move on. Black Myth is up next, tested first at 4K and rasterized. This is a heavy workload for these cards, the 5090 at 86 FPS average and holding strong for frame time pacing as indicated by the 1% and 0.1% lows. The RTX 4090 is next at 67 FPS average, followed by the 5080 at 58 FPS average. This has the 4090 as 16% better than the 5080 and the 5090 as 48% better than the 5080. The RTX 4080 Super and 4080 are functionally identical and give the 5080 an underwhelming 6 FPS lead, which is about 12% here. The 5080 leads the 7900 XTX by 17%, with AMD's card falling disproportionately behind in this test with its 49 FPS result. Lows on the 7900 XTX are commendable though and show impressive consistency. Strong prior gen cards include the 3090 Ti at 45 FPS average and 3080 at 36.6 FPS average, with the 3080 yielding an uplift of 57% to the 5080 and similar for the 6950 XT. At 1440p, the RTX 5090 leads the chart at 130 FPS average, making it 23% better than the 4090 and 34% better than the 5080. These numbers for the 4090 comparison are down compared to 4K like we talked about in the 5090 review. The 5080 and 4080 are disappointingly close at only 9% improvement for the 5080. The lead over the 7900 XTX also reduces down to 13% here, with lower resolution drawing them closer. Noteworthy other cards include the 3090 Ti at 74 FPS average, the 7900 XT at 71 FPS average, which isn't bad considering its price at various points in history, the 3080 at 62 FPS average, and the 2080 Ti at 45 FPS average. Scaling continued at 1080p, where the 5090 boosts to 160 FPS average from the 130 FPS result at 1440p. The 5080 still trails the 4090, but they get close, and the 4090's advantage is reduced to 6%. That's just 6 percentage points away from victory for Jimmy on the team. Generationally, the 5080 leads the 4080 by 7%, down from its lead of 9% at 1440p and 12% at 4K. The 7900 XTX still trails by about 10 FPS here. It's a shame that AMD decided not to compete at the high end this generation, from what they say at least, because a generational step over the current XTX might have been a serious contender to the 5080. There's still time, but let's move on. Starfield is up at 4K. First, we have to address this absolute roast of a comment from our 5090 review, and this one I read a few times, made me laugh. Leave more like it. It said, quote, "I would like to correct one mistake GN made in this review, where they stated that there aren't many reasons to play Starfield at 1080p, but in actuality, there aren't many reasons to play this game at all." End quote. Ouch. Well, anyway, at 4K, the RTX 5090 held 108 FPS average and led the 5080 by 41%. Not the best we've seen, but still a large gap. For reference, the 4090's 92 FPS average led the 4080's 71 FPS by 30%. Comparatively, that makes the gap between the last generation 90 and 80 class cards smaller than the current generation in this game. Against the 4080, the 5080 is about 5 FPS improved. That's not very exciting. NVIDIA's angle will probably be pricing here. The 7900 XTX actually defeats the 5080 on a technicality in this one as well, with frame time pacing equivalent between them and the average FPS functionally identical. There's no perceptible difference between these, which is a benefit to the 7900 XTX in this rasterized scenario. At 1440p, the 5090 climbs to 147 FPS average and leads the 5080's 110 FPS result by 34%. That reduces the lead versus 4K. The 7900 XTX also climbs with a very slight but irrelevant victory over the 5080, with lows identical when rounded. Against the nearly perfectly matched 4080 and 4080 Super, the 5080 holds an unimpressive 2.5% lead. Wow, that's really worth benchmarking. Older cards worth highlighting include the 3080 FTW3, RIP EVGA, at 72 FPS average, and the 2080 Ti at 50 FPS. AMD's 7900 XT is also noteworthy for its performance when considering some of its historical pricing. At 1080p, the RTX 5080's 132 FPS average gives the 4090 a lead of 17%, and the 5090 a lead of 24%. The 5080 matches the 4080 equally here, with the 4080 Super within error, just like its entire pointless existence, sort of like Starfield at 1080p. Back at you, commenter. The XTX also nearly equals the 5080, although NVIDIA has an advantage on a technicality. Let's move on. Dragon's Dogma 2 is up now, first at 4K rasterized. Say something about this game in the comments, see if it gets in the next one. The RTX 5090 ran at 133 FPS average and held well-paced lows behind it. Its lead over the 4090's 98 FPS average is 35% here, with the lead over the 5080 at 57%. This is one of the largest gaps thus far, so for comparison, the 4090 led the 4080 non-super by 36%, meaning that the 4090 and 4080 were closer together to each other than the 5090 and 5080 are to each other. The 7900 XTX's 77 FPS average has it outperforming the 4080 cards and behind the 5080 card, which leads by 10%. The 3080 did okay in this test at 50 FPS average. It's not bad for the relative age on the card, still pretty new though, with a 71% improvement jumping to the 5080. 1440p has the 5080 at 134 FPS average, achieving 71% of the performance of the 5090 at about 50% of the price. The RTX 4090 leads the 5080 again, this time around 20 FPS. As for AMD, the 7900 XTX lands at 126 FPS average for a 10 FPS gap between the two cards. The 4080 lands at 122 FPS average, keeping the 5080 at 10% ahead. 1080p has the cards crushed together, although there's still a gap of 49 FPS between the 5090 and 5080. That's 30%, which is a lot for 1080p, but this isn't necessarily a scenario to plan for. The RTX 4080 is right next to the 5080, although the gap is 10 FPS average. The reality is that very few people would notice the difference between these two sets of numbers in this particular game. This is where we would test Cyberpunk Phantom Liberty, if it worked. We've had repeat issues with getting the 50 series cards to run Cyberpunk without some sort of game level issue occurring where sometimes it just won't launch or it crashes. We had this with the 5090, but we reinstalled the game, wiped all of its local data, and that fixed it. We can't state for certain that it is a fault of the 50 series cards and not some other game update, especially because Cyberpunk has had so many problems over the years, but what we can say is that it continuously kept breaking. So we removed it from this review until the game is more stable. It was crashing or it wasn't launching. We tried to fix it a few times, and there's just no point in testing a broken game, or at least a broken game on these cards. So we'll look into this more later potentially, but for now, because we're not sure if it's unique to the 50 series or not, and because we know Jay had a similar issue in his testing, we're just going to move on. Dying Light 2 at 4K is next. The 5080 ran at 81 FPS average, giving the 4090 a 13% lead and the 5090 a 56% lead. That's a large improvement for the 5090 over the 5080. The 4090 improved over the 4080 by less, at 36% here. The 5080 leads the 7900 XTX by 12%, with the 7900 XTX's 73 FPS average result landing between the 5080 and the 4080. Speaking of, the 5080 leads the 4080 cards by about 21%. We're seeing large gains from the 3080 to the 5080, as expected, with the 2080 Ti below even the 3080. At 1440p, the RTX 5080's 149 FPS average puts it close to the 7900 XTX's 141, with lows between them also comparable. The 5080 is advantaged, but that gap was larger at 4K. The 5090 also has its lead cut down to 45%. Although still significant, the doubled price with the 5090 jeopardizes its value for anyone not using it in VRAM-intensive work scenarios. The 4080 cards were again almost identical, reproving why we didn't waste our time in that review. The 5080 leads them by 12%. At 1080p, the 5090 led the 5080 by 44%, which is really more impressive for the 9800 X3D than anything else. It's genuinely really exciting from a CPU standpoint. This is a GP review, but man, the 9800 X3D continues to impress. This is a gigantic gap when considering how any prior CPU we've used for these benches would be bottlenecking the top 2 to 3 cards at this point. The 4090 maintains a lead of 19% here over the 5080. In Resident Evil 4 at 4K, the 5080 fell behind the 7900 XTX by 4 FPS. Lows are about the same, but advantaged on the 7900 XTX. The 5090's lead over the 5080 is massive in this one, at 68.9% with these settings. That's a huge gulf, and looking back, the 4090 led the 4080 by 47%. There are 2 main ways to look at this. One is that the 5090 is just that good, or 2, the 5080 is just that unimpressive. To figure out which it is, we can compare the 5080 to the 4080. The improvement here is 19%. NVIDIA's best argument for itself will be the price, as compared to the original 4080, and the 7900 XTX wins that argument in this particular game though. At 1440p, the advantage in the 5090 over the 5080 is reduced to 56%. It's still a lot though. The 4090 is still more than 50 frames per second faster than the 5080, with the 7900 XTX now 4% ahead. It's not a huge gap, but considering the generational difference in the price of the XTX here, we remain disappointed that AMD has signaled it likely won't launch a replacement this generation. Maybe they'll reconsider. The 5080's lead over the 4080 drops to just 11% here. We're on to ray tracing testing now, and Black Myth Wukong is up first, with a caveat that this game is unbelievably NVIDIA favored. We have other tests for RT that are more balanced, but this one is one of the heaviest workloads, and it also happens to benefit NVIDIA. Cyberpunk would also fit that bill if it worked, but we removed it for stability issues that we mentioned earlier. At 4K with FSR as defined in the chart title, the 5090 held 88 FPS average, and the 4090 ran at 65 FPS average. The 5080 ran at 59 FPS average, and that sets a 15% lead over the 4080 FE's 51 FPS average. Some notables here: the 3080 just can't really handle these settings, and it's down at 28 FPS average. Jumping to the 4080 from the 3080 would be an 83% uplift in this test, with the 5080 giving an uplift of 112% total from the 3080. Sadly, the 7900 XTX is worse than the 3080 in this benchmark, and as for the 5090, it ran 51% higher frame rate than the 5080 with these conditions. Sadly for Jimmy though, the 5080 did not defeat the 4090 here, but there's hope. By presenting a 1080p chart with FSR, we were able to let Jimmy win. The 5080 operated at 122 FPS average, and what's that? The 5080 outperforms the 4090 in this one by 1.5 FPS average. You're welcome, Jimmy. No one said that the win had to be meaningful, and a win is a win. Tater tots are still tater tots. As soon as I reported the results to the team, though, it sounded like there was a rematch for the 5070, so we'll look forward to that. The 5080 roughly matches the 4090 in this result, with the 5090 leading the 5080 by 30%. The 1080p restriction with FSR is what's making these less exciting than typically, except for the factor of the bet over the tater tots. Dragon's Dogma 2 with RT is up next. This one is more balanced. The RTX 5090 at 4K ran at 113 FPS average with maximum RT, which puts it 33% over the 4090 and 57% over the 5080. The 7900 XTX is much more competitive in this one than Black Myth, running at 66 FPS average and landing between the 4080 Super and the 5080. The generational uplift is 16% from the 4080 FE to the 5080 FE here. At 1440p with RT, the 5080 held about a 7% lead over the 7900 XTX. It's not bad for AMD's last gen card in this game. As for the 4080 FE, the 5080 is about 10% ahead. Not very exciting for NVIDIA, it's a side grade. 5080 is just kind of boring in this one, so let's move on. At 1080p, the 5080's 146 FPS average had it only about 9 FPS over the 4080. The 5090 still keeps a 33% lead over the 5080, despite slimming down versus the 4K results 57% gap. It's not interesting, let's skip ahead. With ray tracing for Dying Light 2 and tested at 4K and upscaling, the 5080 ran at 67 FPS average and trailed the 4090 by over 10 FPS. The 5090 led the 5080 by 63% here. It's a lot. Over the 4080, the 5080 leads by about 17%. The 7900 XTX is between the 3090 Ti and 4070 Ti, trailing the 4080, and obviously therefore trailing the 5080. At 1440p with RT and upscaling, the 5080's 117 FPS average lands at 12% ahead of the 4080. The gap is shrinking here. The 7900 XTX trails somewhat significantly and gives the 5080 an advantage of 35%. At 1080p, the 5090 proves that there's still headroom in the CPU, impressively, with its 224 FPS average, leading the 5080 by 41%, but the 4080 and 5080 get squished together with only a 9% advantage to the 5080 between them. The 7900 XTX is closer to the 3090 Ti here, keeping the 5080 about 30% ahead. Finally, for RT, Resident Evil 4 at 4K with upscaling is up. The RTX 5090 ran at 210 FPS average with these settings, or a 54% improvement over the 5080's 136. The 7900 XTX is much more competitive here than some of the others, with the title generally being a lightweight RT implementation. We keep it around for that reason. We have one heavy title, like Black Myth, and it helps to keep balance and represent with a lighter one. The 7900 XTX looks much better here than in the other RT tests, and the 4080's 117 to 119 FPS average makes the scaling in the 5080 overall boring, unfortunately, with the improvement being hardly noticeable. Here's 1440p, the 5080 jumps to 205 FPS average, the 5090 to 290 FPS average, and the 7900 XTX to 195. The XTX is still competitive here, especially given the price and generational differences. Likewise, the 4080 still makes the 5080 relatively uninteresting, so feels like a side grade once again. Power efficiency testing is next, measured using power interposers and capturing only GPU power. We're not measuring total system power for this and instead isolate for the GPU. The PCIe slot is intercepted and measured as well. Idle power consumption is far better on the 5080 than the 5090. Keep in mind that idle power testing is very situational to the monitor, the counter monitors, refresh rate, power plans, but our test setup is identical unit to unit, so that's all that matters here. They're all under the same conditions. Under these conditions, the 5080 was at 12.75 watts when idle on desktop. This is close but improved upon the 4080's 15 to 16 watt idle power draw, both of which are far below the 4090's 29 watts and 5090's 46 watts. Now for the efficiency, this is a calculation of FPS and power, so having a lower power and a higher FPS will result in the best number here. Final Fantasy XIV at 4K had the 5080 at the top of the chart for efficiency. Comparatively, this is a great result. Its 298 watt draw here leaves headroom in the TDP budget, with relatively high frame rate enabling it to outperform the 269 watt 4080 Super for efficiency and performance alike. It also outdoes the 5090, which scored 0.34 FPS per watt. The 5080 significantly outdoes the RX 7900 XTX, which ran at 0.24 FPS per watt and 430 watts. This appears to be a possible strong point for the 5080. 1440p gives us a lot more cards on the chart since we've tested more mid-range devices this generation, but with the downside that the high-end devices scale their best at 4K. That means that we lose some of the frame rate scaling advantage they might have. The 5080 is still tied for the most efficient on this chart after rounding, aligning with the 4080 Super as the most efficient GPU we've tested yet. It's at 0.75 FPS per watt while pulling 290 watts, up from 268 watts of the 4080 Super, but also up in frame rate. The 4090 pulled 386 watts here, with the 5090 at 520. For efficiency in F124 at 4K and with RT, the RTX 5080 ties the 4090 and is within reasonable variance of the 4090 and 4080 Super results. The 5080 pulled 330 watts in this test, putting it notably lower in power consumption than the 5090's 569 watt draw here, but still more than the 4080 Super's 291 watts. The 7900 XTX is significantly less efficient in this particular workload, hampered in part by RT, but also just by its 422 watt draw. As for extras coming up, we still have a lot of testing with ITX cases, so we're testing specifically the FE dual flow-through design in ITX cases, because we want to see how this does pushing air straight through the card when there are smaller situations to work with. So that's coming up. We also have transient power tests coming up that's looking at power excursions to see how big are the spikes. We also have a video about MFG, or multi-frame generation, that is almost 100% complete. It will probably go up tomorrow. We'll see when this video goes live, but that is coming up. That delves into NVIDIA's new DLSS and frame generation technology, which is going to be important to talk about because they won't stop talking about it. And it's what's caused some of the marketing pain for some of these cards. So otherwise, that's all the numbers in this review. Let's just do the quick recap. First, thermals on the 5080 FE cooler are good overall, and the acoustic profile is similar to the 5090 FE cooler. It's actually a little bit quieter. You can check out our 5090 FE review for that and for the frequency spectrum plot. We think the FE cooler execution on the 5080 remains good. It was pretty good on the 5090, and this is just a lower power card. It works better here, even though they don't have liquid metal, and they've gone with a cheaper heatsink solution that we'll talk about and possibly a teardown. The efficiency is toward the top end of the charts, and the card seems to be more within the optimal power range than the 5090. For gaming performance, this is one of the largest gaps we've seen between the top two cards. The 5090 leads the 5080 anywhere from 30% to nearly 70% in 4K benchmark results. The 5080 is relatively boring uplift over the 4080, unfortunately, but this must be why NVIDIA is pushing MFG so hard. The 7900 XTX is a strong competitor in rasterization, but it is assailable in ray tracing. Finally, the low VRAM capacity continues to be an unfortunate way to segment the 90 class cards into a sort of professional users camp. The 5080 being a 16 gigabyte device destroys its usefulness for at least us for things like Adobe Premiere and Blender rendering, where we really use the VRAM here. That actually makes the 3090 Ti's more useful to us than the 5080s as an example. But that's probably the plan to drive 5090 sales. Unfortunately, the 4090 cards have largely evaporated, or there might be a strong argument for them still with that VRAM boost. There were several partner models at $1,200 to $1,400 in the pre-launch listings. $1,400 is insane to pay. Do not pay $1,400 for a 5080. That is like a 40% increase over the MSRP. That is not worth it. And the value is absolutely not there for that much money. The $1,200 models are also suspect, and actually, the $1,000 ones, the value just isn't that compelling either. So, unfortunately, this is just how NVIDIA's positioned these cards, where they're creating such a gap between the highest end thing and the next one down these days that it's clear segmentation, but there's room to put something in the middle, like a 5080 Ti or something. And we also continue to take issue with, and we'll continue to talk about, NVIDIA's massively misleading marketing performance chart that we talked about in the 5090 review. The 5080 is back for that. It's shown as being 2x the speed of a 4080 in several tests. That's interesting. We didn't see that anywhere. But again, this has to do with its MFG 4X mode that, once again, is still basically the same color as the background when you look at the footer text for the chart. That actually discloses what's going on. And we're testing that. We have thoughts on it. The boring range of 10% to maybe 20% in some situations is more common. But as for MFG itself, again, we have full benchmarks on that, and we also have, as part of that video, a huge discussion on why NVIDIA's knowledge is very out of date on PresentMon. So we'll talk about that in that video. This is why, though, NVIDIA is pushing MFG so hard. The 5080, without it, would look like an incredibly boring product generationally, with maybe some exception for the efficiency behavior. But the gap is sometimes like 10 FPS versus a 4080 Super at the same price. And it's just too hard to get excited about with that. So it seems like a tool to create 5090 sales really more than anything else. As for the bets of tater tots within the office, it looks like Jimmy wins this one. But I've already been informed that there's a rematch for the 5070 versus the 4090 claims. Because who would get up on stage and say something like,
okay, so 5070, 4090 performance, $549.
Other than the CEO of NVIDIA, I mean, who would do that? That's the 5080 review. We kept it simple for this one. You've got all the charts and numbers to make your decision. We have a lot more benchmarks coming up for everything else that's launching. So they've got 2 more cards. AMD has the RX 9070 and 9070 XT. That should be launching in March. Unfortunately, looking at the 7900 XTX results here, it sounds like AMD is not launching a replacement for that card this generation, which is just kind of a shame because that means there's no competition in the high end of the market. And based on these numbers, maybe there would have been space for them, but we'll see what they do. Anyway, in March, we'll be reviewing those. And then we've got the Intel Arc B580 and B570 reviews up. If you want to look at something that's in the cheaper end of things, they're actually relatively competitive for Intel's positioning right now. So that's it for this one. Thank you for watching. Subscribe for more. You can go to store.gamersnexus.net if you want to support our reviews process and our testing, or you can go to patreon.com/gamersnexus to throw a few bucks our way to continue the efforts of what we're doing. Subscribe for the rest, and we'll see you all next time.